Begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord God, you came, you died on the cross for us. You gave up everything. You spent yourself on people who did not love you. But by so doing, you've helped us to know you, even by stops and starts, to experiencing you more in our lives, and to know that we want to be more like you. That the world is not as it should be, but that you are working to make it right. Lord, I pray that you will open our eyes to see, give us ears to hear today, so that we may know the means you've given us through the cross to love the world, to be part of your changing and healing work among people, among mankind, among creation, so that we and others can know you better. Have your way among us, Lord. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are going through a series this summer on the parables of Jesus, and we're going to be looking at Luke, a parable in the Gospel of Luke today, Luke 16, verses 1 through 9. It's the parable of the shrewd manager, or the unjust manager, if you will. So I want to go ahead and read through it and tell us a little story. We're going to talk about how this applies to our lives today. So here we go. The parable of the dishonest manager. He also said to the disciples, that's Jesus, there was a rich man who was a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master has taken the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill, write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. I'm going to start today, before we get into this too deeply, I want you just to put your imagination hats on. Picture for me for a second. I want you to picture a man in a hotel room. He's standing over his bed, and he's laid out several suits. He takes several ties and lays them out next to them as well. He lays a pile of tie clips and cufflinks on the bedstand. And slowly he starts putting himself together. He puts on the suit, puts on the shirt, slides the tie. You see him putting on the cufflinks and throwing a jacket over the top. And he's looking good. He's looking good. He's probably got his finest wear on. And he starts going through the desks, the drawers in the room, and he starts pulling out all the cash he can, and he puts it into a wad. You can tell he's got a lot. He wishes he had more. It's not, but it should be enough. Hopefully it should be enough. And he puts it in his pocket. And the last thing he does is he adds a pin to his lapel. And as he removes his hand, you see it's the Nazi swastika. And he heads downstairs. He goes to what appears to be a private party. People dancing and eating inside. The maitre d' stands in his way, but after a quick bribe in his hand, he's allowed into the party. After bribing his way in, he goes and he sits at a table by himself, casually examining the room. He smokes his cigarette, and he drinks his champagne, and he sees men and women around the room, men with SS on their collar, and the women that accompany with them, that are accompanying them. He targets a couple of tables. He says to the waiter, he bribes the waiter too, and says, take drinks to this table, and take drinks to that table. And slowly these tables that are around the room, start receiving expensive bottles of champagne and new rounds of drinks at their table. And they're told they're from that man who seems to be disinterestedly smoking in the corner. They go over to them and they say, "Excuse me, who are you? Why did you do?" "Oh, I'm Oscar Schindler. Come over to my table. Join me." And one by one, the tables that had started all separate gather around this man, Oscar Schindler, who's buying them drinks, and it turns drinks into food. And then the next thing you know, pictures are being taken. And by the end of the night, there's not tables all around the room. There's one man with his giant table, and everyone in the restaurant celebrating him, taking pictures with him, drinking his champagne, eating the food that he's provided, and celebrating all that is Oscar Schindler. Now, some of you will know who that is, or you've at least watched the film starring Liam Neeson called Schindler's List. But this is the way, by and large, this is some of the opening scenes. This is how Schindler is introduced to us as a war profiteer, as a member of the Nazi Party. But one thing we do have to give it to Schindler is he knew 3 things about what it took to accomplish his goals. He knew his people. Okay? He knew his people. His people in this case were the Nazis and the higher-ups of the SS. He knew his goals. He knew his own goal was to make money and to capitalize on the wartime perspective. And his last thing is he knew his means. All right? He knew that he needed money to make money, to buy people, to establish an empire. And while he left that party that night with almost no money in his pocket, what he did leave with was almost the entirety of the higher-ups of the SS in his pocket. Because they loved him. And they were now prepared to incorporate him into a much bigger scheme. And while we know that, for those of you who've seen the movie, you know the story, that by the end of it, Schindler's heart changes. He experiences the truth of the Nazi Party. He finds his own motives shallow, and he leaves those behind. The truth was, originally, his goals were money, but whether his goal was money or his goal was to save many lives, what he did was he saw that all his resources, all his money, all his gifts, all his talents, and all his relationships were means by which to direct the course of his life and the course of many others' lives. In our parable today, Jesus concludes with a similar conclusion. It sounds weird to hear him say it, but his conclusion is, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. In the same way that the steward lived, so that people, when he was kicked out of his job, would be welcomed into other people's houses. Right? And this seems kind of an odd conclusion. It doesn't seem very Jesus-y, right? I think in our day and age, we think about the idea of using money to make friends as manipulative, right? It's disingenuous, certainly, right? It's selfish. It's not the kind of thing that an honest, good person should be doing, sort of whatever background you're from. And the truth is, we feel this way about our own culture, right? We get frustrated with lobbyists that work within our government to further the rights of big business instead of further the rights of people. And we see this all over in our culture. And yet, actually, it might even be more innate than that. It's people using whatever means are available to accomplish their ends. This starts with the very small child, right? The child that is supposed to go to bed but doesn't want to. And the only means it has available to itself is to fake cry for 45 minutes in its room, hoping, against all hope, that you will eventually go, fine. You can get up, you can have your snack, you can get your drink of water, I'll read you another story. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you because I can't handle it anymore. But the thing that's driving the lobbyists and the baby is the same thing. It's the ends justify the means, right? Whatever I have to do to get there, I'm going to use the means that I have within me to accomplish my goals, even if they are less than reputable. Yet this seems kind of less than conducive with Jesus as a person, right? I don't know that that's the way we should actually apply it. Even if we were just to wait, since Jesus is talking about the use of money, maybe we should just talk about how Jesus used money very quickly, right? We can see that Jesus did use money. Sometimes we get this idea in our culture that like, oh, money's bad. Well, no, I mean, Jesus used money. It was necessary to get around. They carried a money purse, and they used it for things. They would go into towns, they would buy food. We're told that they would distribute that wealth to people who were in need. But that's the thing about Jesus. He gave away his finances by and large. He used what he had to, but he by and large gave himself away like the rest of his life. He gave away his healing. He gave away his teaching. He gave away his time. Yet the steward, in all his corruptness and cunning, is praised by Jesus for the use of his resources in ways that seem reprehensible to us, right? And he lied to prop himself up at the cost of someone else. But if Jesus told us there must be something for us about the way the steward uses that money, his energy, his time, his resources, that's worth emulating. And so we need to ask today what that is. And the first thing we should understand is that Jesus is not always super clear in parables. Like, he wants us to wrestle with it. He wants us to wrestle with the truth of whatever he's telling us and actually figure out what he's trying to say to us. An example of this is in Luke 18. I want to read a short section from a parable in Luke. The verses, I think, 2 on. It says, Jesus says, in a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because the widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come back and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice. And at first glance, when we read this parable, it might seem that God is heartless. We are the poor sinners who may ultimately bug God into giving us what we want, but it won't be because he wants to. It won't be because he really cares. It's only because we are so annoyed that we give up and we let the little kids stay up, right? Yet the author tells us in Luke that the moral of that story was that we should always pray and never give up. In this parable, God is compared to this judge to whom justice is just a matter of complete indifference. Yet the only thing we find that God actually has in common with the unjust character of the unjust judge is that he allows himself to be moved. Not by the letter of the law, in this case, but by the motivations of their heart. Where the unjust judge was moved by his frayed nerves, he actually isn't interested in giving out justice. But he's so upset by it, he's willing to listen to the woman who comes with a plea. Yet, God the Father, who ultimately has to obey all forms of justice, bends, in a sense, kind of bends the rule, provides another way for our salvation. And he still comes to us with the Father's heart, right? He's willing to pursue us with the Father's heart, and that's why he's willing to be moved. So if an unjust judge will give justice because he can't stand being annoyed, how much more will God help those who cry out to him like children? So in this way, the steward is intended to show us what it means to use our resources in a godly way by means of a negative image. Okay? And so let's look at this. Let's look at this example here, the parable today, and let's figure out two things first: what the parable is about, okay? What it's actually intended to show us, and let's start with what it's not intended to show us. So if we throw up those first verses here, it says there was a rich manager who was accused. All right. Rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was wasting his possessions. It doesn't actually say there was a manager who was wasting the possessions, right? This is not about if the man was guilty going into it, right? So we aren't told that this guy had actually been caught doing anything, only that the manager had heard a rumor and decided to act on the accusations, right? So while he may have been guilty of wasting the manager's possessions, that actually isn't the point of the parable. The parable is not about the kind of person he was as defined by his past, but about the kind of person he's showing himself to be when brought into a situation where the true motivations of his heart are revealed, okay? So it's about the way he lives in the present situation. So forget about whether he's guilty or not. It's about how he reacts to his current set of circumstances that we're dealing with today. He goes on, in verse 3, says, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. Okay, and he goes on to explain his plan. So faced with imminent dismissal, he says, what shall I do? Okay? And this is what the parable is about. How our actions reflect the true motivations of our heart when push comes to shove. And the way he sees it, he really has two options, and they aren't dig or beg. Okay? I'll give you this is, spoiler. The two options are change or don't change. Okay? When brought up against these hard situations in his life, he can either figure out ways, he can either change, or he can try to figure out a way to not change. And this is what I mean by that, okay? He knows that if he's dismissed for dishonesty in his trade, right? If you're an accountant and you go to jail for embezzling funds from your employer, when you get out of jail, you're not like, well, I guess I'll go be an accountant again. No one's going to hire you for that job, okay? If this guy is dismissed for dishonesty in his field, he will be blacklisted from his profession, and he goes, well, okay, I can't stay the same. If I can't stay the same, what are my other options? And he identifies physical labor and begging. And now, when we think, well, that seems like a pretty limited list. All right, first of all, it's a parable, it's a different culture, etc., etc., etc. But the point is, I actually think that what this guy did is he said, okay, if I didn't stay the same, what would my other options be? And he starts putting himself in these other positions. And I think the two that he chose are interesting, okay? Because they challenge him in two main ways. What I'm going to call psychologically and physiologically, okay? So physiologically, what we believe to be deemed right, be right and good for ourselves physically, and psychologically, what we deem to be right and good for ourselves mentally and emotionally. And if we look at the physiological one, what we need to realize is that when he says, I'm too ashamed, or I'm not strong enough to dig, he doesn't actually say that he's physically unable or physically incapable, only that he currently wasn't strong enough. To take on this position would require him to work harder than he would like, to develop muscle mass, to be stretched and molded into a new person. In short, to change beyond his goals for himself physically. And the same thing is when we look at psychologically. We're not told that he actually couldn't make a living begging. Actually, a lot of people do that. It seems that he actually could make a living begging. It's just that he was ashamed to, right? He was so used to looking down on people who made their money that way, he couldn't stand the idea of associating himself with that group of people, right? He didn't want to alter his impression of himself. He didn't want to be changed and molded into a new image. And so once again, it was beyond his goals for himself, mentally and emotionally. He didn't want to be changed. And I think in this way, he's not so different than you and I. He says that his goal is just to be loved, appreciated, provided for. He wants to be welcomed into other people's homes without having to alter himself beyond what he knows he's comfortable with. So, if he won't change, what will he do? He'll try to stay the same. But to do it, to not change, he has to know three things. He has to know the people he's working with. What's the community? In this case, it's his master and his debtors. The goals he has for himself, that's to establish a safe home for himself elsewhere, and the means he has to accomplish those goals. This is the master's debt books and his current position that he's about to lose. Okay? So he calls in each one of his master's debtors and he cuts their debts down to ensure himself a place to go after he's been fired. And he's thinking tactically, he's thinking goal-oriented here. And where you and I would assume that the manager would be super angry, right? That he would come and file charges. We read in verse 8 that the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. And this seems weird to us. But what we have to be careful not to do here is to assume that Jesus is like, oh, no, it's cool. Like, everybody's cool. Just do your thing. Look at that. He's got this fun character trait. What a neat guy. Jesus didn't say that. He doesn't call him the noble or the creative or the really neat steward, right? He calls him the unjust steward. And when we read Jesus' title for this man, the way he treats this character in Scripture, he's not saying, I'm condemning this or condoning this action. He's saying, I'm applauding this man's faithfulness to his cause. At least he knew who he was. At least he knew what he was living for, and at least he took risks to get it. And I think this is found in Jesus' phrasing. In verse 8, he said, the master commended this honest steward because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So in this parable, the manager knew the stakes of the game he was playing. This was business, and the fact that the manager, the rich man, didn't see it, he was kind of like, I got you. I pulled one over on you. I knew the stakes of the game. I knew what I was called to. I knew what I could get away with, and I did it anyway, even if I knew you wouldn't like it. And the manager knew it. And he said, all right, bravo, you got me this time, all right? Because they both knew what they were doing, and they lived accordingly. The ends justified the means. And so in this way, living according to his identity as a child of the world, he's living out of the values of the world. And it may be possible for some of you and I, as we sit here today, or if you're listening online, to be bothered by this idea of being children of the light or children of the world, right? In our culture today, we don't like to sort of divide people like, these are the good people, and these are the bad people. And if you're a bad person, you'll steal stuff, because that's who you are, right? And I think our temptation is sort of just to have that gut reaction against something like that when we hear it, but please stick with me, because I really, really don't think that's what Jesus is saying. We have to know that Jesus' audience here, okay? And if we were to look at context around this here, what we find is that Jesus is speaking primarily to two groups of religious people. One, he's speaking to the Pharisees. These are religious leaders of the day who did not follow him and who disagreed with pretty much everything he said. But he's also speaking to his disciples, the people who did follow him, and the people who were supposed to agree with everything he said. What he does say is that his followers ought not be driven by money in the same way. And I think what we need to be careful is that, just to clarify what the Bible's perspective on money actually is, because I know sometimes we talk about that in church and it kind of we get caught up in why are we talking about money? But we're talking about much more than money. But Jesus shortly after this parable says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And everybody sort of knows what Paul says in 1 Timothy when he says, the love of money is the root of all evil. It's sort of like a cultural, just a culturally understood statement at this point. But that goes back to Paul. What he really says is the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And so what we should walk away with is that money itself is not what's evil, but it's the love of money. It's the service of money as an end and not a means. That's the problem Jesus is trying to help us avoid. He's not making a distinction between the good people and the bad people, because he's talking to his followers and people who don't follow him. He's not making a moral distinction about these people. He's only saying this is the way it should be. And he's asking everyone who's listening today, and that's me and that's you, to ask ourselves a few questions today. So I need you to ask yourself some questions. What identity are you living out of? Who are your people? Right? What are the rules you find yourself adhering to? And whose values are you demonstrating in your actions? Okay? What identity are you living out of? What are the rules you find yourself adhering to? And what values are you demonstrating in your actions? Because we all have our subcultures, right? Just like the shrewd manager who's in this particular business world and lives according to these values and responds according to these values and finds his goals out of these values, he's living according to who he is, right? But we all do this. Politically is the easiest example just to put up. And I'm not doing this to make anybody mad, so you can be mad and write me an email later, it's fine. But reality is that in recent months, some 2,300 children were separated from their parents at the border, right? And I know right now, there are some of you going, but there's more to it, let me tell you about it. I want to tell you why it's okay and why the administration has the right to do it. But I'm actually not interested in having that conversation right now. What I'm asking you to do is, what people are you speaking for right now? Right? What values, what identity are you living out of when you defend that? What are the rules you find yourself adhering to when you feel the need to come back and tell me why I'm wrong? What values are you demonstrating in your actions? Is it the message of Jesus? Or do the ends justify the means? Similarly, in our country, each year there are hundreds of thousands of babies that are aborted. And I know as I sit here, there are probably some people who would hear this message and who would go, but no, Jordan, you're wrong. You don't understand women's rights and why you don't even have the voice to speak to it because you're a man, and we'll go on, right? And no, I'm actually not interested in having that conversation today. I'm not interested in fighting, but I'm asking you to ask yourself, who are you speaking for right now? Whose voice are you speaking with? What goals are you propagating? Whose message are you adhering to? And is it the message of Jesus? I realize these are complicated issues, and I don't want to make it sound simple, but it's not even always so simple. How many times in church do we see the same stuff get in our own way? We love our own tribe. We love the way we live, the way we think. We adhere to our own common set of beliefs in a way that sometimes stops us from actually hearing the whole message of Jesus because we're only interested in hearing part because that's the part that we like. If I toyed with this idea, but what if I just wore a cutoff and torn up jeans up here? How many of you would actually not hear a single word I said the whole time? Because you'd just be thinking about where you were going to go to church next week. Right? If you can show me in Scripture where Jesus says, pastors got to wear a tie, I usually do. Okay? But this is just a thing. It's not in Scripture. It's just a cultural expectation you have, and you assume that if I don't wear a tie, I don't love Jesus that much. No. Whose voice are you speaking with right now? What motivations are you living out of? Is it the message of Jesus? If Paul got up here next week and decided he was only playing organ from now on, how many of you would be here and he learned some of the piano? It's probably great, right? It's the same thing, right? No, of course not, right? How many of us, I don't know, I'm going to want to go here next week if Jesus decides, or if Paul decides he's only going to play the organ, right? Right? Or worse, what if Paul decided this week, while y'all are gone, he's going to get rid of the organ altogether? It's going to be gone. You're going to get back and be like, where'd the organ go? I love the organ. It's gone now. Paul got rid of it. What's going to happen? How long before the angry emails come in? What are we going to do because the church is ruined? Whose voice are you speaking for? Right? What's your motivation? Where's the message? Is it the message of Jesus? If Paul comes up here next week and decides from now on, I'm only playing synth music. That's how we're doing worship from now on. No instruments, just Paul up here with a little synthesizer. We're going to have weird beats going, and that's how we're going to worship. I'm not saying we're going to do that. I'm not saying that's a good thing. But what I am saying is sometimes we let things that are not the gospel become the gospel. And we lose the message of Christ, and in it we lose who we are. There's nothing wrong with caring for the unborn. There's nothing wrong with caring for women's rights. There's nothing wrong with border security. There's nothing wrong with caring for immigrants. But here's the thing. We need to acknowledge that we tend to look to our own needs first. Our own wants, our own desires, over the needs, wants, and desires of others. And we have the tendency, like the steward, to figure out ways to stay the same. And not in a good way. To exchange the values of God for our own values. Be it Christian or non-Christian, we all fall victim to this. Yet, Jesus was living according to his identity as not a child of the world, but as the Son of God. He was living out of those values to achieve his goals. Jesus said we should use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. But the truth is, we have not and often do not use our time, our money, and our resources in a way that is loving and generous and kind. And we have not earned the right to come into God's house. When we are let go from this life, we have not earned the right to be welcomed in to the loving arms of eternity, into God's house. But as Christians, we know someone who has. and that's Jesus. Because Jesus knew his people. That's you. He knew his goals. That was to love and save you. And he knew his means. That was to live a perfect life you could not live and die in your place so that you could share in his eternally one perfect life. Jesus stayed the same, but not for himself. Unlike us, unlike the disciples, unlike the Pharisees who listened, Jesus did what we could not do, and his tactics were to give it all away. First to give up his place in heaven, to come down, then to give away his authority on earth and become a servant to all. He did this by giving away his abilities, giving away his money, and ultimately giving away his life. And in this way, we're called to rest in the grace he offers us. To rest in the fact that for those who have confessed their faith in Jesus, there is nothing else more they need to do to be saved. The work of Jesus' work is enough. But this parable is also an invitation for us to rethink who we are and towards what ends we are living. Towards what end are your resources given? Are you too afraid to live for Jesus because you must defend your rights, your tribe, your goals? Sometimes we're too afraid to be rejected by our own tribe, whether they love Jesus or not, to listen to him. But Jesus promises to be with us. He is the negative image of the unjust steward. And in this way, he is the just steward. The steward who did everything right, who gave away everything, knowing that when he was dismissed from his calling here on this earth, he would be welcomed home. And he's offered you that same right, knowing that you cannot do it. And the truth is, Schindler, to bring it home, knew it too. In the last scene of the movie, it's a very moving scene. The war has ended. Schindler at midnight, Schindler would become a war criminal and going on the run. And while he had saved 1,100 people, 1,100 or 1,200 people in his factories, and they made him a ring out of the gold taken from a man's teeth, is all they had to offer. He found himself breaking down. He looked at the car he was supposed to get away with, and he says, this car's 10 people. Why didn't I sell it? Why didn't I sell this car and have 10 more people here today? And he takes that same pin, that Nazi pin that started the whole thing, off. And he says, this is made of gold. One more person. I could have gotten one more person. And as we head into our time of communion today, I want us to be reminded that for Schindler, or for you and I, the message today could be, get your priorities straight. Live better lives. Love God and love people according to Scripture. Get God's otherworldly values in you in the same way the steward lived according to his own values. But the truth is, just like Schindler found out, just like all of us find out if we're honest, that your priorities aren't straight. You can't live the perfect life you were meant to. But you can trust in God's otherworldly values and his love for you. Read his word, pray to him, ask him into your hearts, live in a new way today, and trust him to actually be the one who delivers. Who gave all. So there isn't one more life that can't be saved.